All right. That's quite the announcement. My apologies. I'm getting over COVID. So I am quarantined in my basement. So you can see my wonderful basement here. So if I'm coughing, I apologize. Try to keep it to a minimum. All right. So I hope is to make this useful for you guys. So please ask questions. Any questions you want to. I've got some content I'm going to run through, but otherwise, feel free to raise your hand, interrupt, and ask questions. I've been hiring for engineering for about 8 years now. We've hired a fairly large team at this point. We've very, very purposefully iterated on this process and refined this process over that time period to kind of figure out what are we targeting, how are we hiring, what are the people that we want to bring in, how do we look to retain them. So it really, though, boils down to some pretty simple things that hopefully will be helpful. So as we think about hiring, we're really trying to assess 3 kind of large chunks. One of these being problem-solving ability. So how do you approach a challenge? What sorts of questions do you ask? How do you break a large problem into smaller pieces? What parts do you tackle first, right? Like, what solutions do you choose? Why do you choose those solutions? So how do you really approach taking a problem, defining a problem, and solving a problem? The next thing we're trying to assess is technical proficiency. So as we interview, we let you choose the language you're going to interview in, right? So how skilled are you with your chosen tools and technologies? As you build a solution, is it reasonable and readable and reasonably well organized, or is it just scattershot, right? And then we're looking for kind of teamwork and personality. So on smaller teams, our engineering teams, individual teams are generally around 6 or 7 engineers. Individual personalities matter a lot. And so how do you interact and communicate with the person interviewing you? Are you taking initiative and asking questions and offering ideas? Do you just kind of sit back? What do you do when you get stuck? How do you ask for feedback? How do you receive feedback that the interviewer is giving you, right? And generally, are you someone we want to work with? Because at the end of the day, bringing someone onto a small team who's really abrasive or doesn't mesh with the culture of that team or how they work is challenging. So that's really how we kind of build our rubric for interviewing and the things that we are trying to assess throughout that interview process. So how do you prepare for technical interviews? The biggest thing about technical interviews is breaking down problems and building solutions fairly rapidly, right? So when you're going to interview, you're going to get kind of different types of questions. There's the rote algorithmic questions, and you either know them or you don't. Those questions are useless. We don't ask them because, again, either you know it or you don't. Do you know a depth first search? If you do, I've learned nothing. If you don't, I've learned effectively nothing. But you might get asked those questions. Some people still like to ask trick questions. I don't know why. They're not particularly useful. You might get them. I hope you don't. Outside of that, though, you're really going to hopefully get 3 questions. Super straightforward, easy questions, right? Or super straightforward, hard questions. But like everything's there. Or you're going to get questions that kind of seem easy, but are actually nuanced and turn into more difficult solutions as you progress, or things that sound really challenging but aren't actually that difficult. And the intention with those types of questions is to have you, again, walk through that problem solving, break the problem down, understand what you're trying to do, iterate through those solutions, and kind of figure it out as we go. In the world of software engineering, though, there's not that many novel problems. And so many times pattern recognition becomes important in this process, right? Understanding what what type of thing am I actually trying to solve for, and then having a general idea of how to solve for that. You don't have to go memorize a bunch of solutions. You can work through the logic if you understand what you're trying to do. There's many good resources for doing this. If you're early in your career, the best way to get better at this is just to practice. Cracking the Coding Interview is a fantastic book, purely because it breaks down a lot of these classifications and gives you different representations of those problems, right? And so you can start to get used to, what does this look and feel like? What does this sound like? So when you run into something, you can go, oh, this is very similar to this. I know how to do this, and get started in a direction that helps you feel confident and make progress in the interview. Project Euler has a lot of math-based problems. If you're interviewing for a specific framework, this is going to sound ridiculous, but Google Rails interview questions, React interview questions. Unless you're interviewing at a gigantic company, I can almost guarantee you the people interviewing you are doing the same thing, right? There's not like it's not like a secret time to interview book. Here's a list of great questions. But again, like this will get you a good idea of, these are the types of things I'm going to be asked. These are the types of questions that I'm going to be asked, and just help you prepare, right? So when we're assessing candidates, especially for more junior roles, right? We want you to understand the framework or the technology that you're interviewing for to the level that you present your experience. We interviewed a candidate years ago who said he was an expert in Rails. And then he had to Google in the interview how to traverse a string character by character. And it was like, all right, I mean, you put expert on your resume, right? Like, if he had said junior Rails developer, go Google it, right? I have no problem with this. But he had misrepresented his experience, which now I've got to look at the rest of what you said and kind of take this with a grain of salt. So we try to level set based on, how do you represent your level of knowledge and experience? And then how do you present that throughout the interview process? So if you're interviewing for a role in Python and you've said, hey, I'm a junior Python developer, and that's where we net out, fantastic. Like, we're all on the same page here. But the more you know about that framework and the more you can speak to it and effectively act, the better. Yeah, Duncan?
Hey, sorry, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is something that, like, when I was, we had to fill out our LinkedIn and everything like that. There were definitely, like, obviously through the cohort, we've had exposure to things, and like, I'm relatively, as a beginner, like, I'm relatively comfortable with them. But is it important to, like, even in our LinkedIn, specify like junior level JavaScript experience, or something like that? Do we need to specify every, what we actually categorize our experience level at?
No. So as you're building a resume to send to someone, right? Like, everybody puts at the top or at the bottom or somewhere on the resume, like, here's my skills, right? Yeah, okay, I look at that. But I'm actually going to go into your resume and see what you've done. And so if your skills say that, let's say you've done some Python and some React and some ES6 and some TypeScript, right? And like, that's in your skills. And then I go down into your experience and I see, okay, like, there's some projects here, and he's graduated from this boot camp or this immersive coding thing. Like, all right, I'm going to level set around, this person is early in their career, they're learning. What wouldn't be great, if you can't back that up, is at the top to put expert in React, right? Or senior React developer. And then I look and I see only projects, because the first time we talk, I'm going to poke on that to understand. Senior React developer, like, there's not a lot here. Like, what's missing on your resume, right? That justifies this. And maybe you are a giant open source contributor and you have a big background, and that's your opportunity to speak to that. But if you've misrepresented that in the resume, then we're off to not a great start. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, so really being able to kind of speak to what you know, and it's okay to not know things. When we do an initial phone screen, for example, for our front end developers, one of the things we're trying to assess is what is your level of knowledge, right? So our front ends are in React, and so we're poking at like how much have you worked with React, order of magnitude, the size of applications you've worked on, how much have you worked with Redux, how much have you worked with TypeScript, right? It's not great when you say, yes, you have experience, and then we ask for that experience and you kind of fumble your way through a non-answer. It's entirely okay to say, no, I haven't really worked with Redux. I've used the context API instead, right? That's perfectly fine. And again, this is about like just accurately communicate where you're at. The expectation bringing someone in who's starting their career is they're going to have to learn, right? Honesty goes a long way here in helping these interviews go smoothly. So what do technical interviews generally look like? Usually you're going to get a phone screen first, a technical phone screen. This is a set of simpler questions, sometimes done with HR or hiring manager, sometimes done with an engineer. We do ours with an engineer. This is meant to just weed people out, basically. The questions are simple. If you can't answer 4 simple questions, then like we're not going to invest 4 hours of our time in the next sets of interviews. Once we get past that phone screen, we do pair programming interviews effectively. So they're meant to be collaborative, and then a culture fit and a work history, right? So technical interviews themselves are, the success of that interview is dependent on 2 things, right? 1, you as the person who is interviewing, and 2, the person who is interviewing you. Too often it is assumed that the person who is interviewing you knows what they're doing and is good at interviewing. Very often engineers are just asked, hey, I need you to do an interview. Like, okay, what question do I ask? Right? Like, well, we got some questions over here in this folder, go look at them, right? Like that person isn't necessarily a good interviewer, right? And so this is the bit where hopefully you only get people who are great at interviewing and they engage you and ask you questions and help you when you get stuck and like they know how to navigate this. But especially in technology, this isn't always the case, right? And this is where, as someone who's interviewing, you are able to make a difference in the outcome of that interview, right? So when you step into these technical interviews, you're generally going to get 1 or more questions, right? Those questions will just be given to you and you're kind of left to your own devices at that point. Biggest thing I can tell you is don't panic. Don't get super nervous. A lot of interviews get ruined because people end up very jittery, unable to speak, like they just lock in anxiousness and nerves. Stay calm, take a step back, try to assess the problem, try to break the problem apart, ask questions, right? Don't make any assumptions. If you're going to make an assumption, state that assumption out loud, right? Like, I'm going to assume we don't have to deal with this, or I'm going to assume the following is true. That gives me, the interviewer, the opportunity to say, oh, hey, hold on, we actually can't assume that. Or, yeah, no problem, keep going. The worst thing we can do is spend 45 minutes going down the wrong path, right? And so as someone who's interviewing, I want to make sure we're headed in the right direction. Ideally, if I see you going in the wrong direction, I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to say, well, have you thought about this? Why are you choosing to do this way, right? Asking you to kind of take a step back, assess what you're doing, and explain it. I might just be looking to understand, do you know why you chose to use an array over a hash map, right? Like, do you know the difference between the 2 data structures and how they're represented in memory? I might be asking, like, why are you doing this? Because I don't think it's the right choice. In which case, if you still go down that path, I might poke it a little more. But the biggest thing that you can do as you start executing against that problem is to state, here's what I understand the problem to be. Here's how I'm going to attempt to solve it. Here are my assumptions. You know, it's getting that out of the way. So clarifying that problem domain, clarifying how you're going to approach the solution, letting me as the interviewer understand, here's how you're breaking down the problem. Here's how you're thinking about a solution, right? Like the technical interview itself is the journey of the interview. If you get a working solution at the end, awesome, right? If we got 50% done with the solution and you didn't finish because we ran out of time, but I knew where you were going and it's a great approach and we were going to get there, fantastic. You are not penalized for not finishing at that point. If we get to the end and you're halfway done and you've told me nothing and I have no idea where you were going, I can only walk away and go, I have no idea if we should hire this person, at which point it almost always becomes a no, right? As the interviewee, you have to prove to me I should hire you. Like that's your responsibility here. Like we interview a lot of people. I can't keep bringing people back over and over and over, hoping that one of these times, like, oh yes, that is the person. And so communication is such a huge, huge part of that. If you get a problem and you're thinking of multiple possible solutions, talk about it, right? It's helpful for me to understand that you see this and you see two possible approaches, right? And you're thinking about, well, I might do this one. And maybe I know that one's not going to work. I can say, oh, hey, we should try this one instead. But you want to tell the story to your interviewer of, here's what I'm thinking, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to do it. And give them the chance, if you are off track, to course correct a little bit. Does that make sense? All right, I got some nods, so I'll say yes. All right. So we'll move past that for the moment. We can come back if there's any specific questions there. So we do a work history interview. The purpose of the work history interview is kind of twofold. Resumes are like the ultimate paper tiger. Like you read a resume and you're like, wow, this is amazing. Then you get people into an interview and ask them what they actually did, and it is a shadow version of what they've put on their resume. So when we dive into the work history, what we're really trying to understand is, what did you actually do in that role, right? And less often we're looking for, what did you do from a technical knowledge standpoint, right? Like that is important, right? But if another company hired you as a senior developer and you were there for 3 years executing that role, the likelihood is, you know, you've written a good technical solution. Like we're going to assess your technical knowledge elsewhere. What we're looking for in that work history interview with what did you actually do at your role is, how did you perform your job function, right? Do you have a history of demonstrated success? Are you getting into roles, getting into different organizations and succeeding at what you do, right? What made you successful there? Are you taking initiative and looking for your own success, or are you just kind of showing up and hoping for the best? Similarly, are you growing throughout your career, right? Like, are you introspective? Like, do you look back on a job that you had 6 years ago and think, the exact same thing, especially in software engineering? Like as you do more and more, you look back on what you did before and you're like, I was an idiot. Like, all right, I'm so much better now. And then rinse and repeat over and over and over and over again. And so, you know, we're looking for, you know, think about what you did 6 years ago, right? And we actually asked during this, like, if you did that time again now, what'd you do differently, right? Because almost always you do something differently. It might be technical, it might be from a communication standpoint, from a relationship standpoint at work, right? Like, but people should be growing and they should be looking at what they've did and analyzing what they've done and growing from that. Similarly, like when you're in a position at a company, do you show growth, right? Are you looking to embrace new technology? Are you looking for opportunities? Are you creating opportunities for yourself to be successful? Or are you just kind of there? And the last thing we're looking at is what keeps you engaged in a position, right? We want to hire people and we want to keep them. It's hard to hire. It's hard to turn people over, and the ramp up time is high. And so when we're looking to hire someone, we want to understand what motivates you. What are you passionate about? What do you enjoy? Like, what keeps you engaged at your job? And so understanding as you work through your history, what kept you in a role? And when you left to go to a new role, why? Right? Is it the same thing over and over where, lack of growth opportunity, lack of growth opportunity, lack of growth opportunity? Great. We can give you growth, right? Is it a myriad of interpersonal reasons? Like what's the thing that gets you to leave a company versus stay at a company? So this is where I would tell you to be absolutely honest, right? Too often people try to give disingenuous answers during this process. It is often exceptionally transparent when you're just trying to tell me the things like why you're so excited about my company and why you think this is the role for you. And like, I will flat out ask people, like, if you were designing a role for you, just for you, what would it be? Right? Like, what technologies would you work in? Like, what would your balance be? Time spent writing code versus planning and architecture and system design. And be honest here, right? And I'm not saying be honest because I don't want to hire dishonest people, but no one wins if we hire you and 3 months in you realize, oh, I actually don't like this at all, right? Like everyone loses in that scenario. Now you're looking for a new job, we've got to go hire someone again. We want to bring people in and have them enjoy where they're working and invest in their career and grow them and retain them. And similarly, as you're looking to join a company, you should be talking to the engineers that you're interviewing with to understand, like, is this work environment going to provide you with what you are looking for and what you need to be successful, right? Almost every technical interview should leave time at the end for you to ask questions of the people who are interviewing you. Ask them real questions. Nothing is more frustrating than when we get to the end and it's a list of like, what's your favorite technology to work in? Like, really? Like, that's what you want to know about me? Okay, we can talk about the team or how we work or the technologies or expectation, anything, right? And it's like you Googled questions to ask at the end of an interview, and these are the questions you're asking me. Okay, so think about like what are the things that are important to you at a company? What opportunities are you looking for? Like what type of support are you looking for? What type of work environment? And talk to the engineers that are interviewing you. They should be answering these questions. And if you're getting very, very different answers from different interviewers about the same things, then this is a good data point for you. Maybe you need to press here with somebody else, but making sure that it's a good fit for you as well is really, really important in this equation. Similarly, though, if you have gotten into a situation that's not a good fit and you're looking to change jobs quickly, be honest about it. We just hired a guy who we hired him about 4 months ago, but he was interviewing and he withdrew from the interview process. Well, that's fine, right? 6 weeks later, he emailed back again and wanted to interview. And my first question was, what happened, right? Turns out he had accepted a role. He thought the role was going to be remote. As soon as he started, they were like, so when are you moving to Phoenix? At which point they said, well, technically it's remote, but everyone else is in Phoenix and we're going to open an office. And so you really need to move to Phoenix. He was not looking to relocate. He had a young family. And so very, very quickly, he's now back on the job market. But that was obviously my first question. Like, you just took this job and you're leaving as an employer. Is this someone I want to hire? But he had a very honest, very real answer as to why. And so, we're happy to move forward at that point. So if you get in a bad situation, don't be afraid to move early. Just be honest about what you're doing and why you're doing it, right? All right, this is all the stuff I had prepared. So it's not that much. Any questions? I'll answer anything. So
Yeah, I guess it's pretty trivial. I've never actually asked this before, and it's something that's bugged me. Like in regards to questions, like I've had interviews before where, is there anything you'd like to ask us? And it's like I genuinely don't have anything that's really like pertinent or pressing. Is it okay to? I mean, is that looked like negatively upon? Because you're talking about honesty and everything. And if there's, if I feel like the environment looks good, maybe I've spoken to someone in the company and I'm aware of the environment and overall stuff. Is it okay to be like, I think I'm good. I don't have anything
That
to
is
really ask.
completely fine. So generally, when I am interviewing candidates last, right? Engineers have already interviewed them, like they've gone through things, they've had the opportunity to ask many, many questions. I do get candidates who say, yep, I've had all my questions answered. I don't have any more questions. That's completely fine with me. Ideally, though, if everyone you interviewed with, you didn't ask a single question about the company, about how we work, about anything, then that's a little weird. Like you're interviewing for this job, you're talking to the people who are doing the work, and you don't have a single question about culture, work-life balance, what it's like to work with these people, and so of the whole group you interview with, we all sync at the end, right? And so in isolation, it might be weird for one person to say, wow, we had no questions. If you didn't say, for example, I got all my questions answered in previous interviews. If you didn't say that, you're just like, no. But then we'd regroup and I'd find out, oh, you actually asked all these people questions. You probably didn't have any more questions for me. But I would say phrase it as I had my questions. They've all been answered.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Guillermo?
Yeah, Joshua. So typically there's three buckets of questions, right? There's method questions, right? Brute force questions, and then algo questions. You said your company doesn't ask any algo questions. So out of the first two kinds of categories, can you give me an example of a very type of common question that you guys would ask, like something involving loops or a hash map that are very popular? Because typically there's like favorites, right? Can you give me one of your guys' favorites?
Yeah. So for example, a question I really, really like to give people, actually, I haven't done a technical interview in several years. This is all questions that I have engineers give people, but question I enjoy. We ask people to implement a scaling LCD display, right? With the little digit breakdowns. And you're gonna pass in a integer, and then it's gonna scale the display, 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x. And it sounds really simple. Model the digits with line segments, print the digits, but you run into two tricky bits. One of them is the bar segments don't scale the same linearly and horizontally. And then you print horizontally. You don't print a digit, a digit, a digit, a digit, right? And so it's very, very easy to get to an n equals 1 solution. And almost always when we go to n equals 2, the solution doesn't work. It prints funky, right? And so now you get to see, all right, let's double back to your solution. Let's find out what went wrong. How do you step back? How do you address it? How do you try to change things? Like you'd be surprised how many people just operate under the guess and check method. It's like, okay, guess and check is not going to get us there. Like, let's please understand algorithmically, like what did you write that didn't work the way that it was supposed to? And so this is a question that sounds really simple, right? We give you the digits. We show you the segments to print each digit, print them out. But when you get into that little bit of additional complexity, it starts to become a more challenging or more interesting problem to solve. And there's many different ways to solve it, right? But it's not a straight algorithmic question, right? It's not like, oh, I know breadth first search, I'm good here. It requires a little more thought, a little more planning, and then usually the ability to circle back and reassess your own solution, which is hard. Like this is something that is challenging for people to do. You got set on a solution. You believed it worked. It now doesn't work. How do you reassess where it might be going wrong? How do you make changes? Again, like going back to communication, this is when it's super, super useful for me as the interviewer to hear what you're thinking. How are you approaching this? What are you looking at? What are you thinking about? Sitting for 5 minutes in silence while you try to work it out in your head doesn't give me insight into your thought process. It doesn't give me insight into how you're trying to solve it. It doesn't give me the opportunity to help you, right? So at the end of the day, my goal in the interview is to figure out, how do you fall into those 3 buckets, right? Problem solving, technical proficiency, teamwork, and communication. And so if I see you're really stuck trying to figure it out, what I'll do is I'll say, okay, well, let me put some digits on the screen for you, right? And I'll put up a digit with 1 size. I'll put up 1 and 3. Then I'll put up like a 5, 1 and 3. And it'll become very clear just from those examples that the vertical segments and the horizontal segments scale differently, right? And so I'm throwing bones as we go, right? Like, let's go. Let me help you, drop some clues in and figure out what that direction is.
So the trick to that is just figuring out the ratio and adjusting your algorithm, right?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay.
That's and the only second bit there is then how do you print it when you have 4 digits, because you're dot matrix style printing effectively, right, on the console. And so, do you keep it and build one giant string buffer and then print that buffer out? Like there's multiple ways to go about it, but that's like the second thing people generally run into.
That's a really annoying
none
question.
None of it's hard. It's all
Yeah.
simple, right? But it almost always yields good conversation where we can start to understand when it breaks down, how do we proceed and how do you talk about it and how do you test and iterate against it, which is one of the reasons why I like it. You don't have to know some archaic thing, but it's not trivial. We used to do there was a problem I used to like, which was effectively the bucket tool in like Microsoft Paint or Photoshop or anything where you click a color and it replaces all the colors. We would ask people to just implement that, right? Using integers as colors. And the reason that was nice is almost always people start with a solution where they duplicate the map, right? And they duplicate all the pixels and then they mark all the ones they care about and then they replace them. But it's super memory intensive. So then you say, okay, well, let's do it in place, right? Which is a little trickier, and people go to a recursive solution. And you're like, well, now we've got 1 billion by 1 billion pixels. We're going to blow the stack. But then this started to be a problem that was getting taught in universities. And so we would start interviewing people, and it was just like, oh, you just know that this is a depth first search and it's trivial. And so we weren't actually learning anything anymore. So we stopped asking it because now it's just like a rote thing that people either know or they don't. It's not actually interesting.
Very cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I do have a question. I mean, junior developers, we require a lot of resources, and at the beginning, we don't actually provide a lot. So I guess my question really is, how do you expect junior developers to provide value to a company, or why do you hire juniors?
That is a great question. So when we are hiring junior developers, we are ensuring that we're staffing to hire junior developers. So we have to have engineering bandwidth to support that person, right? Help them learn, help them grow. The flip side of that and the why is, if I hired all senior developers, I could maybe have, like, of the 30 engineers I have now, maybe I could have 12, right? 12 senior engineers isn't going to do all the work. It doesn't work, right? And so when we think about hiring and retention, the reality is you're going to hire people early in their career, middle of their career, later in their career. The people earlier in their career, middle of their career, you want to apply a force multiplier to their growth. You want to help those people grow, at least me, you want to help those people grow as rapidly as possible. Because now we're both winning in this equation. You are more productive for me, and you are growing faster in your career. At some point, right? We're going to promote you and keep doing that, or you're going to take that new growth and go to another organization, right? And find a new opportunity. Like this is kind of at every level, you have some turnover. So when we think about hiring junior engineers, what we're looking at is how can we staff in people early in their career who demonstrate a high degree of aptitude that we can make an investment in, accelerate their growth, and then keep them here for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, continue to help them grow. And now you're contributing at a very productive level, right? But we have to make that upfront investment, which is why so much work goes into hiring to make sure that this is a good fit. It's a good fit technically. It's a good fit from a culture and communication standpoint, right? Yeah, Guillermo.
Seth can go. I already had one. I can go after.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Hey, Josh. Just had a question kind of talking about like, once you have junior developers on your team, trying to kind of retain them, what are some of like the mistakes that junior developers make once they actually get accepted to your teams? Where like, do you have any advice where us as junior developers can kind of like take advantage of things that normally junior developers don't see right away? Kind of like different directions that we can go, or questions that we could ask, or opportunities that we could take advantage of?
Yeah, so there's two things. So the biggest mistake that people make is they don't ask enough questions, and they don't ask for enough help. So there's a line. You don't want to be the guy who always asks about everything, right? Everyone's always fearful of being that person. And especially now that people are remote, they end up asking so little, and they will toil and toil and toil and spend 30 times the amount of time they need to on something, right? So I will give you a great example. We just had this happen where we were working with Google. We were spinning up some applications in AWS and Elastic Beanstalk, and we needed to spin up an environment. This takes 5 minutes if you know what you're doing. It is literally trivial. And after an entire day, a developer finally reached out and asked how to do it. And I wanted to be like, you spent 8 hours on a 5-minute task? Like, I wish you would have asked me immediately, right? And she was reading all the documentation. It was like, you don't have to do any of these things. It's point and click over here, right? Like, this is trivial. And so err on the side of asking too many questions. Absolutely. Like they're have a good reason to ask the question. Do your diligence, do your research, right? Like don't just be the guy who constantly gives up and asks. That's not positive. But provided you're putting through your best effort to solve the problem first, ask, right? Like the anticipation is you are going to need to learn and grow, right? The other thing that I would say to do is don't shy away from opportunities to do more. This is something I've seen more of, which is interesting to me because I'm not sure how it's going to play out. And it's this idea of, well, I'm not going to do more if you're not going to pay me more. Like, okay, but how do I know you can do more then? And so like people who seek opportunity and see an opportunity to do something and go do it, as an employer, I go, ooh, this person, we want to keep this guy, right? He is executing in his job function and doing well, and also identifying opportunities for us to be better as a team or as an organization and helping make those investments or make recommendations, right? Like that's a value add thing that shows that one, on a personal level, you're invested in growing and being more successful. But then on a company level, like you care enough to go out of your way to put a little extra effort in, right? Which at the end of the day might result in you getting more things to do. But these are going to be different things, right? Things that hopefully facilitate growth opportunities and then promotions and compensation increases, right?
Josh, I'm sorry, just to ask what may be a dumb question on this. Can you name like 2 or 3 like examples of like easy junior developer projects or opportunities that you've seen people pass up like coming from the military, like I have ideas of like, hey, volunteering for things. But what does that look like as a junior developer volunteering for things in order to like actually get experience?
Yeah, so I think the biggest things would be as you're working inside of, the reality is that most companies you're going to step into a code base that's existing, right? And so not all code bases are created equal. We had a guy who came straight out of college. He was working for us, and we had this legacy web code base that was written in a silo by one developer with no coding standards against it. It was a mess, right? And when you're looking at that, you go, wow, we'd love to apply a linter to this and we'd love to apply style rules, but this code base is giant. And so how do we go about doing this? And so what he did was he came up with a set of sane linter rules that are just community standards and wrote a quick git commit hook that said, okay, code you touch, we're going to apply the linter to automatically when you try to commit it. Code you don't touch, we're going to ignore. We're not going to punish you for editing a file and touching one line, and there's 1,000 other lines in that file you have to fix. Nope, you touch one line, your line has to match, right? But he went out of his way on his own time because he cared about it. He's very passionate about this, right? And we put this in for the whole team. And now as we continue to work, like you've started to build that climb toward where we wanted to be. And it wasn't a lot of work on his side, but it did show a lot of initiative, right?
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Guillermo?
So this is kind of a two-part question. So interviewing tends to be kind of a crapshoot in pretty much every industry, which is something I'm kind of worried about. You're pretty much flipping coins. So two-part question. One, is tech doing a little bit better than flipping a coin? And two, what does your company do to ensure that you're doing better than flipping a coin when you're hiring someone?
So tech in general, I don't know if it's any better than flipping a coin, right? Like that's a fair thing. The idea of the technical interview is a challenging one, right? Like how do I get you? No, the reality is people are bad at interviewing in general, right?
And can be exceptional employees. Absolutely.
And well, even people who are interviewing you are bad at conducting interviews. They're not great at assessing skills. And it's hard in a 1 hour window to really understand everything that you bring to the table. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to de-risk that hire. I would say I think we do pretty well. So since I've been at the company, I've been here 7.5 years, right? I was employee 22. We grew to about 200 some odd before COVID. Post merger now we're about 550. We've probably hired about 45 folks in that time in engineering. We've had to fire 5 people, right? And most of those people we retain for, our average tenure is like 3 to 4 years. So I would say we're doing pretty well as far as screening candidates and trying to find the right fit, and then investing in making those people successful, which is the follow-up bit to the hiring equation. But we don't do leak code problems. We don't do standard algorithmic problems. We very, very purposefully stepped back and thought through, what is it going to take for someone to be successful in our organization? And we came out with 3 things. You have to be able to solve problems well. You have to be able to look at something and figure out, what am I actually trying to do? How am I going to solve this problem? How am I going to affect the solution? You have to be able to communicate. You have to be able to talk to the people on your team, people on other engineering teams, right? People in product, people in customer service, like people in sales. You're going to have to be able to communicate with them effectively, right? Because we're not a 1,000-person engineering organization. And so you're going to have to take on meaningful bits of work and deliver those bits of work, right? And we bias toward people who, throughout the interview process, even for new hires, right? And this is where, like, let's talk about, what did you do in college? Did you have any other jobs? What did you do with those jobs? Did you take initiative? Did you demonstrate success? Like, we're biasing towards people who can demonstrate that throughout the interview process, right? And then investing in making those people successful. Which if you're coming into a junior engineering role, one of the questions I would encourage you to ask in the interview process is, what does the first 90 days look like, right? How do you support and onboard new engineers onto the team, right? I like when people ask me this question because they're almost always shocked. I give them a clear and concise answer to how do we onboard engineers, right? If you're getting a really wishy-washy answer, a lot of places don't have very well-defined onboarding processes. Like, you just show up, you get a computer, they're like, "What you get?" They throw you in GitHub, and they're like, "All right, I mean, sit next to this guy." Like, some people do all right in that environment, but it's on you at that point, right? Like, you're not well supported. So I would absolutely recommend asking that, just to understand. We've turned down really good junior candidates before. And I told them, because we didn't have the bandwidth to support onboarding, right? Like, all of our engineers on the team were engaged, and they were going to be engaged for the next 12 weeks. I can't bring someone in and go figure it out. And then in 3 months, if you hadn't figured it out, blame you and fire you, right? Like, that's not fair to anyone. And so we, in that situation, closed the role. So we can't hire this role right now. Like, we're not prepared to support that person coming on. And so I think it's worth asking, how do they support junior engineers? How do they onboard junior engineers? Like, what does that look like? Anything else? Questions? All right.
Alrighty. Thanks so much, Josh, for coming in. Didn't realize you were recovering from COVID, but hopefully your health gets back to 100% soon enough. With that, again, technical interview questions definitely can be challenging. Again, I've had timed exercises. I think Josh mentioned, like, leak code. I've had hacker rank leak code interviews. They're not fun. I hate being under time pressure. I'm sure all of you guys will probably have to deal with that too. I would agree with Josh immensely when he says, interviewing doesn't always dictate if you're a good employee or not, or a good problem solver. Like, again, I'm a thinker. I like taking my time thinking solutions, and I don't do well with timed interviews. So obviously, hopefully, companies are more like Josh's, where they kind of adapt their processes rather than stay with the status quo. But again, it's never going to be 100% mapping to great interviewers. Some people are great interviewers and not so great technically. Some people are opposite. All right, Josh, again, thanks so much for coming in and giving us your time today. And thank you to our students for asking great questions. Again, we have one more series in the career coaching session, and that'll be tomorrow with James Lewis. So hopefully you guys will be here back tomorrow at 5:30 for that. All right. Hopefully you guys all have a good evening, and we'll see you guys tomorrow. Thanks again, Josh.
Thanks, Josh.
Good luck, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.